We live in a world where kindness is universally praised, often elevated as the highest virtue. And in many cases, it is a beautiful, powerful force. But there's a subtle deception growing beneath the surface, a distortion of what it means to be kind. We're being told to be kind to everyone, at all times, regardless of context, behavior, or consequence. And many people, especially those of faith, take that message to heart. They want to do good. They want to reflect God's love. But what happens when kindness becomes an unguarded, indiscriminate offering? What happens when you extend grace to people who only exploit it? At some point, we must confront a difficult truth. Our kindness without discernment is not love. It's self-sabotage. It's an unexamined reflex that, when unchecked, will wear you down emotionally, spiritually, even psychologically. It's one thing to be kind in the face of ignorance or misunderstanding, to offer grace where someone is genuinely struggling. But when your kindness becomes a pattern of appeasement, when it turns into an open door for manipulation, disrespect, or emotional leeching, you are no longer being kind. You're being complicit in your own erosion. This is not about becoming bitter, hardened, or vengeful. It's about the moral responsibility to set boundaries all, to protect the good that's inside you from being dismantled by those who do not value it. And here's the paradox: people who consistently violate your boundaries don't need more kindness, they need consequences. That sounds harsh to some ears, but it's the foundation of integrity. You cannot build a life of peace while allowing destructive forces to live rent-free in your mind, your time, your spirit. You were not created to be endlessly tolerant of abuse masked as human error. People forget that even in Scripture, Jesus himself was never indiscriminately kind. He was loving, yes. He was merciful, absolutely. But he was not afraid to walk away, to call out hypocrisy, or to leave the crowd when their intentions turn toxic. There's a misconception, especially among Christians, that being Christ-like means being endlessly agreeable, perpetually available, and universally pleasant. But that's not what we see in the Gospels. Christ embodied an absolute perfect balance of grace and truth. And where there was sin, he addressed it. Where there was danger, he withdrew. Where there was falsehood, he corrected it. He didn't allow people's expectations to dictate his values. Psychologically speaking, this dynamic plays out in people who have internalized the need to be needed, the compulsion to be liked, to avoid confrontation, to smooth over every discomfort. Often stems from early experiences where love was conditional, where worth was tied to utility. So now, as adults, they overcompensate. They default to kindness in every scenario, even those that demand strength, distance, or resistance. But kindness, when used to avoid conflict, ceases to be kind. It becomes a strategy of avoidance. And avoidance always leads to deeper pain. You have to ask yourself, who benefits from your unfiltered kindness? Is it mutual? Is it healing? Is it fruitful? Or is it enabling dysfunction in others while draining the life out of you? There are people who see your kindness not as a gift, but as a gateway, a path to take advantage of your empathy, your time, your silence. They don't want reconciliation. They want access. And access without accountability is an open invitation for cycles of manipulation to continue unchecked. We must grow past the belief that the good is to be agreeable. Goodness is not passive. Goodness doesn't just absorb injustice or excuse toxic patterns. Goodness sets standards. Goodness speaks up. Goodness walks away when necessary. And that's the kind of goodness that is the wise A. That's the kind of love that honors God because it's rooted in truth. From a philosophical lens, even Aristotle wrote about the concept of virtue as a balance between extremes. He described virtue not as blind generosity or submission, but as a calibrated response, a mean between deficiency and excess. Kindness without boundaries is not virtue. It's the excess of a strength misapplied. It lacks wisdom. It lacks restraint. It fails to consider the context and consequences of behavior. There are moments in your life when being kind will cost you your clarity. It will pull you into relationships you should have left behind. It will keep you silent when you should speak. It will convince you to stay when you should walk away. And not because you're being holy or moral, but because you're afraid. Afraid of judgment, of being disliked, of rocking the boat. But living in fear is not kindness. It's bondage. True kindness is not blind. It is rooted in discernmental. It sees the whole picture. It understands that not every person deserves a front row seat in your life. Some people must love you from a distance. Some people need to experience the silence of your boundaries, not the comfort of your constant availability. That's not cruelty. That's wisdom. And if you really believe your life is a gift from God, then you must protect it with the same intention that you pour into others. Your heart, your energy, your voice. They are sacred resources. Use them wisely. Being kind doesn't mean you allow others to repeatedly violate your peace. Being kind doesn't mean you say yes when everything inside you is begging you to say no. And being kind certainly doesn't mean sacrificing your calling on the altar of other people's dysfunction. Kindness without discernment is not love. It's self-betrayal dressed in virtue. And the sooner we stop applauding this distortion, the sooner we can begin living in truth. One of the greatest misunderstandings people carry, especially those trying to live morally or spiritually upright lives, is the assumption that kindness and goodness are synonymous with being nice. That being agreeable, compliant, soft-spoken, and conflict avoidant is somehow the ultimate mark of character. This belief is not only inaccurate, it's dangerous. It creates individuals who are deeply repressed, incapable of asserting truth, and emotionally exhausted by their own inability to say what needs to be said. And this confusion, tragically, is often reinforced under the banner of religion. We're told to be like Jesus, and rightly so. But what does that actually mean? When people say, be like Christ, they often only think of his tenderness, his compassion for the broken, his gentleness with the hurting. And yes, those are true and vital parts of who he was. But that's not the full picture. What's often conveniently ignored is that Jesus was not always nice. In fact, he was unapologetically confrontational when it was necessary. He rebuked leaders, exposed hypocrisy, and walked away from crowds that didn't want truth. He wasn't interested in surface-level peace. He was committed to righteousness. There's a profound difference between being nice and being good. Niceness is often a social lubricant. It's about keeping people comfortable, avoiding offense, and maintaining appearances. But goodness requires clarity, strength, and the courage to say what's unpopular. It demands that you sometimes make others uncomfortable for the sake of truth. And that's exactly what Jesus did. When he entered the temple and saw people turning a house of worship into a marketplace, he didn't smile and ask politely for them to reconsider their behavior. He flipped the tables. He made a whip. He created disruption, not because he lost his temper, but because he was defending the sacred. He was expressing moral clarity in the face of corruption, and he wasn't concerned with how it looked to others. He was anchored in purpose, not perception. Now think about that in your own life. How many times have you swallowed your voice, suppressed your discomfort, or tolerated dysfunction because you thought it was the kind thing to do? How many times have you allowed people to violate your boundaries or speak down to you because you feared that pushing back would make you look ungracious or unchristian? That kind of thinking doesn't come from strength. It comes from fear. And fear, masked as kindness, creates internal dissonance. It divides your soul. To be like Jesus is to understand the right time for softness and the right time for fire rape. It means knowing when to comfort and when to confront. Because if your kindness keeps you silent in the face of wrongdoing, it's no longer virtue. It's complicity. And complicity is a slow form of self-destruction. You betray your own sense of justice and call it grace. But grace without truth becomes sentimentality. It becomes appeasement. It keeps broken systems in place and reinforces bad behavior in people who never had any intention of changing. From a psychological perspective, many of us associate being nice with being safe. If I'm nice, people won't hurt me. If I'm nice, I won't be rejected. But that coping strategy, often learned early in life, becomes a liability in adulthood. It trains us to suppress authentic reactions in favor of socially approved ones. It makes us afraid of our own strength. So we default to niceness, even when the situation requires confrontation, resistance, or refusal. And that fear doesn't disappear. It accumulates. Every unspoken truth becomes a weight. Every tolerated insult becomes a fracture. Over time, your internal world becomes cluttered with resentment and exhaustion. Not because you're doing good, but because you're doing harm to yourself while trying to keep everyone else comfortable. There is a sacred power in righteous anger. Not rage, not bitterness, but righteous anger, the kind that drives you to protect what's holy, to defend what's good, to draw the line where evil tries to blur the edges. Jesus wasn't concerned with optics. He was concerned with the truth of. And the truth is, love that refuses to challenge, love that fears discomfort, isn't really love. It's self-preservation in disguise. Even philosophers as far back as Socrates and Confucius recognized the danger of shallow virtue. They warned against becoming people who speak only to please, who engage in virtue signaling rather than actual moral engagement. We are called to be all whole, not hollow, and to be whole means integrating the lion and the lamb within you. The part that loves deeply and the part that knows when to roar. There will be moments in your life when being nice will feel like the easier road. It will allow you to avoid conflict, preserve relationships, and protect your image. But easy doesn't make it right. And peace that comes at the cost of your principles is not peace. It's denial. You were not made to bend to every situation. You were not made to live apologetically. You were made to walk in truth, even when that truth disrupts. So, the next time you find yourself tempted to be nice, when you should be bold, remember this: you, Jesus, didn't come to make everyone comfortable. He came to bring light to the darkness. And light doesn't ask for permission to shine. It just shines. But there's a moment in every person's life, usually more than one, where they realize they've been living under an invisible weight. It's not a physical weight. It's psychological, emotional, moral. It's the pressure to make people happy, to keep the peace, to not rock the boat. And many people, especially those raised in environments where acceptance was conditional, grow up thinking that the ultimate good is to be liked, to be approved of, to never offend. But here's the true thing: you were never called to please people. You were called to walk in truth. You were called to please God. And that's not just a religious idea. It's a fundamentally transformative psychological shift. Because when your life becomes oriented around the approval of others, you sacrifice your authenticity at the altar of perception. You start calibrating your words, your decisions, even your values, based on what will keep people comfortable. But comfort isn't truth. Comfort is compromise in disguise when it demands the death of your voice. We all crave connection. That's part of being human. But the moment that craving turns into dependency, you've entered dangerous territory. Suddenly, Your sense of self becomes tethered to how others respond to you. If they like you, you're good. If they reject you, you feel worthless. And over time, you begin shaping yourself to fit into every room, every expectation, every mood. You become agreeable, adaptable, polished on the outside, but conflicted on the inside. The philosopher Kierkegaard called this the despair of the self. It's the despair of becoming everything except who you truly are, simply to be accepted. And that's a form of self-abandonment. It may not look destructive from the outside. In fact, it often looks noble, helpful, even virtuous. But internally, you're unraveling. You're living in contradiction with your own conscience. The scriptures speak to this directly. If I were still trying to please man, I would not be a servant of Christ. That's Galatians 110, and it's more than a theological statement. It's a declaration of psychological freedom. It means you cannot serve truth and be a slave to approval at the same time. You have to choose. One will demand your honesty. The other will demand your silence. And here's the reality. Not everyone will like you when you stop performing, when you stop cattering, when you stop smiling through disrespect, when you start telling the truth, setting boundaries, and living with conviction. People will get uncomfortable. But discomfort is the price of integrity. If you never make anyone uncomfortable, you're probably not living in truth. You're living in diplomacy. Now, diplomacy has its place. There's wisdom in how you speak, how you time your words, how you balance courage with compassion. But when your diplomacy becomes a disguise, when it becomes a way to avoid conflict rather than resolve it, you've traded truth for manipulation, and that erodes the soul. Let's be honest, many people don't want you to grow. Not because they're evil, but because your growth challenges their comfort. Your clarity highlights their confusion. Your courage reveals their fear. So they push back. They label your strength as arrogance. They call your boundaries selfish. They make you feel guilty for not bending the way you used to. And if you're not careful, you'll shrink yourself back down just to avoid the noise. But that's not obedience. That's fear. And fear is a terrible architect. It will build a life that looks stable but feels hollow. It will dress up passivity as peace. But peace that costs you your identity isn't peace. It's spiritual seduction. Billy Graham understood this deeply. His sermons weren't designed to win popularity contests. He wasn't trying to please the crowd. He preached the truth, even when it made people uncomfortable, even when it disrupted social norms, even when it cost him favor. Because he understood the eternal principling, our pleasing people may earn you applause, but pleasing God will anchor your soul. In psychological terms, this is what Viktor Frankl described as the search for meaning over the pursuit of pleasure. Approval feels good, sure, but meaning lasts. Approval is fleeting. It shifts with moods, trends, and power dynamics. But meaning is grounded, and when you live in alignment with meaning, when you prioritize truth, character, purpose, your life becomes stable even when storms come. You have to deciding who's writing your script. Who are you editing yourself for? Whose opinion do you fear losing more than your own self-respect? These are hard questions. But if you don't ask them, you'll end up living someone else's version of your life. And here's something no one tells you. The people who truly value you won't leave when you get honest. They'll lean in. They'll grow with you. They'll respect your clarity. The ones who fall away, they weren't loving you. They were loving the role you played in their script. And roles are replaceable. But identities are not. So stop contorting yourself to fit expectations you were never meant to carry. Stop equating obedience with passivity. Stop confusing being liked with being loved. And start asking the harder question, am I living to make people comfortable Or am I living to honor what's right? Because at the end of your life, you won't be held accountable for how many people approved of you. You'll be held accountable for how faithfully you lived out what you knew to be true. Pleasing everyone will cost you everything. Pleasing God will cost you their approval. But it will save your soul. There's a growing misconception, particularly among people who strive to be compassionate, that protecting your peace is somehow selfish, that setting boundaries, limiting access, or even walking away from certain people or situations is unkind, unchristian, or ungrateful. But that idea doesn't come from wisdom. It comes from guilt. And guilt, when internalized without examination, becomes a weapon, one that gets turned inward until the very act of self-respect feels like a moral failure. You are not being selfish when you protect your peace. You are practicing stewardship. That's not a feel-good slogan. It's a spiritual, psychological, and moral imperative, because your peace is not just a mood, it's the inner environment where your mind processes truth. Your heart recovers from wounds, and your soul listens for the voice of God. When your peace is compromised, everything else begins to deteriorate. Your clarity, your convictions, your resilience, even your faith. There's a reason Jesus said, "Do not cast your pearls before swine." That wasn't a harsh statement. It was a profound boundary. He was saying that not everyone is worthy of access to what's sacred inside of you. Not everyone can be trusted with your vulnerability, your time, or your attention. And when you ignore that, when you keep giving out of guilt or obligation or fear of being misunderstood, you are not being holy. You are hemorrhaging. Some people will guilt you for not being endlessly available. They'll accuse you of changing, becoming cold, or turning your back on them. But what they're really saying is that your boundaries are interfering with their control. They are no longer able to feed off of your constant yes, your unguarded kindness, your silence in the face of dysfunction. And that's the moment you have to decide whether you'll shrink back into compliance or rise into clarity. Clarity is uncomfortable. It requires you to say no when every part of you is used to saying yes. It forces you to examine where your people-pleasing patterns came from, why you feel responsible for the emotional state of everyone around you. That's not just spiritual work. That's psychological excavation. And it usually leads to an uncomfortable truth. You've been calling it kindness, but it's really fear. Fear of abandonment, fear of being disliked, fear of confrontation, fear of being alone. But here's the irony. When you without boundaries, you are already alone. No one truly sees you. They see your performance. They see your availability. They see what you do for them. But they don't know your convictions, your limits, or your needs, because you haven't shown them. You've prioritized their comfort over your authenticity. And that, over time, breeds resentment. Resentment is a red flag. It's your soul alerting you that something sacred is being violated. But many people don't listen to that voice. They ignore it, suppress it, rationalize it away. And in doing so, they become martyrs to everyone else's expectations. But being a martyr to dysfunction is not noble, it's self-neglect. And self-neglect has long-term consequences. It distorts your sense of identity. It clouds your decision-making. And worst of all, it numbs your spiritual sensitivity. You cannot hear God clearly when you are constantly immersed in chaos. When your emotional bandwidth is consumed by drama, obligation, and guilt, you lose the quiet necessary for divine direction. That's not just poetic, it's deeply practical. Peace is the space in which you discern what matters. And when that space is overrun by other people's chaos, you start living reactively instead of intentionally. This is where we need to reframe boundaries. They are not walls of pride. They are gates of wisdom up. They're not tools for pushing people away. They're filters for deciding who gets close and why. They are not about controlling others. They're about maintaining your own integrity. Boundaries are how you tell the world, this is who I am, what I value, and how I will be treated. And make no mistake, Jesus modeled this. He withdrew from crowds. He left towns. He didn't heal everyone. He didn't argue with every critic. He didn't stay longer than he was assigned. Why? Because even he understood the need for rhythm. Between pouring out and pulling back. Between healing others and being alone with the Father. That wasn't weakness. That was wisdom. So when you protect your peace, you are not rejecting people. You are honoring your design. You are acknowledging that you were not created to be everything for everyone. You were created to walk in truth. And truth has structure. It has discipline. It has space for rest and reflection. Peace is not the absence of conflict. It's the presence of internal order. And sometimes maintaining that order means disappointing people. But disappointed people are not your enemy. They're just not used to seeing you in your strength. And some of them never will be. Some will walk away when you stop being convenient. When you stop absorbing their pain without reciprocation. When you stop answering calls at 2 a.m. from people who refuse to change. And that's okay. Let them go. The right people will not just respect your peace. They will protect it with you. They'll grow with you. They'll learn to honor your no as much your yes, because they see the whole you. Not just the version of you that serves their needs. You are not obligated to be emotionally available to everyone. That's not cold. That's maturity. You are not unloving for stepping back from relationships that constantly leave you drained. That's not bitterness. That's discernment. And you are not selfish for choosing environments that feed your growth rather than sabotage it. That's not arrogance. That's alignment. Your peace is the garden where your purpose grows. Tend to it. Guard it. And never apologize for protecting what God has entrusted to you. There's a dangerous conception, especially in faith-based circles, that kindness means silence in the face of wrongdoing. That love means overlooking dysfunction. That being a good person means tolerating behavior that, under any clear-eyed analysis, is corrosive. But kindness, when it's severed from accountability, becomes something else entirely. It becomes enablement. And enablement is not love. It's complicity dressed in good intentions. At a certain point, you have to ask yourself, is your kindness helping the person grow, or is it helping them stay exactly where they are? Because not all help is helpful. Some of it is paralyzing. Some of it allows people to repeat the same behaviors over and over with no real consequence. Because they know you'll always absorb the fallout. You'll smooth it over. You'll forgive without confrontation. You'll lower the bar of responsibility in the name of grace. And in doing so, you unintentionally train them to believe that growth is optional. The Bible never separates love from truth. In fact, it explicitly tells us to speak the truth in love, not to suppress truth for love. That distinction matters. Because truth without love becomes cruelty, but love without truth becomes delusion. And delusion is the breeding ground of chaos. When you refuse to hold people accountable, when you continually rescue them from the consequences of their own actions, you're not offering redemptions. You're offering insulation from reality. And reality is non-negotiable. It catches up to people eventually. Whether it comes in the form of a broken relationship, a missed opportunity, or a crisis they can no longer shift onto someone else, the consequences arrive. The only question is whether they will face it sooner with guidance and clarity or later. When it's too late to change course, your kindness, if left unchecked, can delay that moment. It can become a buffer between a person and the very discomfort that might have led to growth. Psychologically, this is rooted in what's known as dependence, a relational pattern where one person consistently sacrifices their own well-being to manage another person's dysfunction. It often masquerades as compassion. It looks like loyalty. It sounds like phrases such as, "I just want to help," or "they need me." But underneath that, there's a deep fear, the fear that if you stop being endlessly kind, the relationship will collapse. And sometimes it will, because it wasn't a relationship in the first place. It was a contract, an unspoken agreement that said, "I'll carry your weight if you let me matter." But you weren't meant to carry everyone. You weren't created to be a shield from consequences. You were created to reflect truth. And truth doesn't always feel good. In fact, it often feels like a rupture before it becomes a revelation. But that rupture is necessary. It's the moment when the illusion breaks, when the story someone's been telling themselves no longer holds up. And if you really care about someone, you won't keep reinforcing that illusion with your silence. This is where moral clarity becomes essential. You have to be able to differentiate between grace and passivity, between patience and permissiveness. Grace says, "I see your potential and I will walk with you." Passivity says, "I see your dysfunction and I'll tolerate it indefinitely." The first is rooted in hope. The second is rooted in fear. Fear keeps people in cycles. It keeps families stuck in generational patterns. It keeps communities from evolving. It keeps individuals from confronting their own capacity for self-deception. And it often wears the mask of niceness, of being polite, agreeable, non-confrontational. But politeness is not a virtue if it protects a lie. Politeness without integrity is just cowardice with good manners. Think about Jesus. He forgave sinners, healed the broken, and showed compassion to the outcast. But he also looked religious leaders in the eye and called them whitewashed tombs, clean on the outside, but dead on the inside. He didn't coddle people. He didn't enable self-righteousness. He exposed it, not to shame, but to awaken. Because sometimes the most loving thing you do is to name what's wrong directly and without apology. This requires strength. It requires the ability to hold tension, to say, "I love you, but I will not support this behavior." To remain rooted in compassion, but unmoved by manipulation. To extend a hand without losing your backbone. That's what maturity looks like. And in a world where most people are addicted to comfort and allergic to truth, maturity is revolutionary. There's a cost, of course. Some people will accuse you of being harsh. Others will say you've changed. And they'll be right. You have changed. You've stopped participating in dynamics that drain you. You've stopped allowing your kindness to be weaponized against your conscience. You've decided that love without truth isn't really love. It's just sentimentality. And sentimentality can't build anything that lasts. When you stop enabling, you force others to confront their own reflection. And not everyone wants to do that. Some would rather keep you in your old role, the one where you never say no and never speak up, never hold the mirror too close. But your growth disrupts their comfort. It destabilizes the balance they've depended on. And that's a good thing. Because sometimes discomfort is the only path to transformation. Your job is not to protect people and the truth. Your job is to embody it with wisdom, with courage, and with grace. Kindness that doesn't challenge, doesn't correct, doesn't confront. That's not kindness. That's abandonment. It's the refusal to participate in someone's growth because it's easier to be liked than it is to be honest. So be kind. But let your kindness carry the weight of truth, because anything less may salve the moment. But it will sabotage the soul One of the clearest indicators that you're starting to walk in truth is how people respond to your boundaries. Some will respect you more. Some will leave. And the ones who leave, they were never aligned with your purpose. They were aligned with your availability. It's uncomfortable to realize that certain relationships were never built on mutual respect. They were built on what you gave, how you bent, how you made others feel. But when you stop bending, when you start standing, you see things for what they are. You see people for who they really were, not just how they acted when you were convenient. The right people, the ones truly meant to walk with you through seasons of growth, will not just tolerate your boundaries, they will honor them. They'll recognize that yourself respected a rejection of them, but a reflection of your inner clarity. But the wrong ones, they will weaponize guilt. They will question your integrity, challenge your character, accuse you of being selfish or cold. Why? Because boundaries disrupt their control. They lose the access they once had. And that loss reveals what the relationship was really built on. In psychological terms, this is the collapse of codependency. When you stop performing, when you stop saying yes out of guilt, when you stop being the emotional caretaker of other people's dysfunction, something breaks. And it needs to. Because relationships built on imbalance are not sustainable. They survive through silence, through suppression, through sacrifice that feels noble until it becomes unbearable. We are trained, especially in polite society, to be agreeable, to avoid offense, to preserve harmony even at the expense of honesty. But harmony without honesty is illusion. It's emotional theater. And eventually, that performance costs you. It costs your peace, costs your clarity. It costs your ability to look in the mirror and say, I told the truth, even when it cost me something. Because that's what real integrity is. It's not perfection. It's not always being nice. It's consistency between your internal values and your external actions. Boundaries aren't walls you build out of bitterness. They are frameworks you establish out of wisdom. They're how you separate what belongs in your life from what doesn't. And if someone is constantly offended by the limits you set, it's often because they were benefiting from your lack of them. That's a hard truth, but an essential one. People who respect you don't push against your boundaries. They learn to live within them. They adjust. They grow. They ask questions. But they don't punish you for protecting what's sacred inside of you. And that's what your boundaries are. They are an act of reverence for what God has placed in your mind. Your energy, your calling, they are not infinite. You have limits. And when you ignore those limits to keep others happy, to avoid confrontation, to maintain false peace, you are not being kind. You are being complicit in your own erosion. There's a deeper, more philosophical layer here. We often confuse acceptance with endurance. We think that tolerating people's behaviors without consequence somehow makes us virtuous. But tolerating what's intolerable isn't virtue. It's self-abandonment. It's moral cowardice. It's the unwillingness to let the pain of confrontation produce the growth that only truth can bring. And truth always brings friction before it brings freedom. Think about the people who've challenged you in the most transformative ways. Chances are they weren't the ones who always agreed with you or avoided your rough edges. They were ones who the truth you didn't want to hear, but needed to. They were the ones who loved you enough not to flatter you. And that same courage, if it was a gift to you, must now be cultivated within you. Not just to challenge others, but to protect yourself. Because your life, your actual life, not your performance, is shaped by what you allow and what you reject. What you reinforce and what you correct. And when you set a boundary, you're doing both. You're reinforcing your worth and correcting the dynamics that diminish it. You're saying, this is what I will allow, and this is what I will no longer entertain. That doesn't make you cruel. It makes you clear. And clarity is the first step to freedom. Not everyone will walk with you once you get clear. Some people will leave. They'll ghost you. They'll talk about you. They'll make up stories that fit their narrative. Let them. That's not your business. Your business is to stay rooted in truth, not trapped in other people's projections. You are not responsible for how others respond to your honesty. You are responsible for being honest anyway. This is where spiritual maturity intersects with psychological depth. You begin to realize that love is not measured by how much you give away. It's measured by how wisely you give. Love is not endless access. Love is intentional investment. And sometimes the most loving thing you could do for yourself and for someone else is to walk away. Not out of resentment, but out of recognition the connection was not mutual. The purpose was fulfilled. The lesson was learned. It's time to move on. Growth often begins with subtraction. You lose people. You lose approval. You lose the false security that came from never making waves. But in that loss, you find something else. You find yourself. Not the version that others liked, but the version that can stand alone. The version that no longer needs to be rescued or praised to feel real. And in that moment, when the noise quiets, when the dust settles, and the guilt fades, you realize that peace doesn't come from being everything to everyone. Peace comes from being fully yourself, fully alive, and fully aligned with the truth. Even if it costs you people who only loved your silence. We'll let the wrong people walk away. The right ones will never fear your boundaries. They'll rise to meet them.